Hallo und guten Tag, dear listeners. Welcome back to Zeitgeist with me, Katja Heuer, your favorite Anglo-German historian. This podcast is part of my blog Zeitgeist, which you can find on Substack for your bi-weekly dose of German history, politics, and culture. Today, I'm excited to be able to speak to someone who also lives in the UK and who is also occasionally kept awake at night by thoughts about Germany. There can't be that many of us, so perhaps there ought to be some sort of club. I'm joined today by Tobias Buck, who was born and raised in Germany. He then studied law in Berlin before joining the Financial Times. He is now the managing editor of the FT, having previously served as the paper's correspondent in Brussels, Jerusalem, Madrid, and Berlin. His first book, After the Fall, Crisis, Recovery, and the Making of a New Spain, was published in 2019. He now lives in the UK, where I'm speaking to him today. We're sitting at the FT's HQ in central London. Welcome to Zeitgeist, Tobias.
Thanks for having me, Katja.
You have just published your new book called Final Verdict, a Holocaust Trial in the 21st Century. I listened to the audiobook version, and I have to say, once I started it, I really couldn't stop. There was so much food for thought about morality, responsibility, crime, victimhood, and agency, and all tie beautifully to one single case, that of a very old man called Bruno Dey, who's still accused of contributing to the murder of at least 5,230 people at the Nazi concentration camp of Stutthof near Danzig in what is now Poland. Can you tell us a little bit more about the trial and your connection to it?
Yes, so I started covering this trial when I was based in Berlin as a journalist for the Financial Times. I had returned to Germany after 17 years as a foreign correspondent in other countries, and I was, I think, slightly surprised to find that there were still these trials going on, that there were still, in fact, perpetrators alive to be put on trial. And I looked at a few of those trials. Some of those actually ended up being terminated because of ill health, which is obviously quite a typical fate if you put people on trial who are in their 90s. And so I started covering this trial in Hamburg, the Bruno Dey trial. He was at the time a 93-year-old pensioner. And I remember very vividly the opening day where this very old man who was sort of hiding his face behind a sort of wooden, a cardboard folder, entered the courtroom, and I was immediately struck by the fact that he was so ordinary, that he was a real non-entity in terms of the hierarchy. He was on the lowest rung of the concentration camp hierarchy. He was a simple guard. He was also only 17 at the time that his duty in Stutthof started. He then turned 18 while he was there. So bizarrely, this trial was actually held in front of a youth criminal court. So I was struck by the fact that he was not a sort of big evil man. He was not one of those perpetrators whose names still live in infamy. He was a fairly ordinary man who at the very end of his life found himself confronted with the sins and the crimes of his past. And I thought it really opened, this trial opened a window to some questions that had always fascinated me. Why did this happen? What would I have done? And I think that last question in particular is much more relevant and in many ways much harder to answer when you look at a case like Bruno Dey. Obviously, we can all tell ourselves we would never have acted like the Rudolf Hösses and the Himmlers and the Körings of this world. But it's much harder, and it became harder as the trial progressed, to, with the sort of distance and comfort of time, say, well, I would never have done, I would have behaved differently. I would have climbed down from the watchtower. I would have handed over my gun. I would have told my commanding officers, no, I don't want to do this anymore. So I think these are really fascinating questions for a historian, but for anyone really, about the contribution that the ordinary people make to terrible historical crimes or indeed any historical event.
Absolutely. I think especially as a German, I don't know if you felt the same way. As somebody who was born and educated in Germany, we kind of grow up with the Holocaust as our historical legacy, almost like, as part of the national consciousness. It's very much part of what you get taught and told when you grow up. How did you, particularly as a German, sort of feel sitting in that trial? You're saying kind of these questions are universal questions, and they are, but maybe for our non-German listeners, just can you try and explain why this is particularly resonant for Germans as a people in a way?
Well, if you grow up in Germany, if you are German, you are confronted with the Holocaust basically all the time. I mean, the Holocaust is a crucial part of post-war German identity. It is taught in schools. There are monuments and memorials all over the place. It is a huge factor in the way that Germans and German politicians look at the world today. When you follow German political debate, be it about the war in Ukraine, be it about attitudes and policy towards Israel, all these crucial modern day political and social questions are often viewed through the prism of the Holocaust and German responsibility for the Holocaust. It is also something that I think is very present in popular culture. I think one of the interesting things about German memory culture is to what degree it's been framed by TV series and movies, and it is often framed, or the German perspective is quite often an attempt to identify with the victims of the Holocaust, to look at the Holocaust through the eyes of the victims. And of course, this position, which is basically one of empathy, is I think very important, but to some degree it has obscured a more important question for the Germans in particular, which is look at this perhaps also through the prism of the perpetrators, the generation of our grandparents and great grandparents. Where did they go wrong? What could they have done differently to prevent the terrible crimes that were committed in Germany's name between 33 and 45? And so again, from that perspective, I thought this trial was hugely illuminating.
And you've taken quite a personal approach to this as well, haven't you? Kind of turning your own perspective around. So you describe in the book how when you first started thinking about the Holocaust as a teenager, you also took this victim perspective into focus, and you went to Auschwitz, you talked to survivors, you wrote essays about it, and it's only really now, as I understand it from your book, that you've sort of looked at the other side of things and looked at your own grandparents as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I remember very vividly sitting in the courtroom, and the way this magnificent, opulent courtroom in this late 19th century Hamburg building was set up was that we the journalists sat in the last bit of the room, and just in front of us was the defendant's family, including his grandsons. And it just made me think, well, could that have been my grandfather in the dock? And then I did recall that a sort of thing from my childhood that I hadn't thought about for decades, which was my grandparents' wedding photo, which showed my grandfather in a Nazi uniform with a swastika armband, and it just stood there and was not really remarked upon by anyone. And it made me revisit that personal history as well, and I was able to find out that indeed my grandfather had been a member of the Nazi Party. As far as I am aware, as far as I was able to establish, he was not involved in any crimes during that period. But I think the message or the lesson that I took away from that was just how ubiquitous in some ways the culpability for the crimes of the Nazis was. My grandfather was one of more than 10 million members of the Nazi Party. Many more millions of Germans voted for Hitler, sent their children to the Hitler Youth, enthusiastically embraced the reign of Hitler, and looked away when their Jewish neighbors were being deported, when Jewish shops and synagogues were attacked and burnt to the ground. And so again, for me, the court case against Bruno Dey was illuminating in that it I think prompted me to think more about where the line between complicity and innocence and guilt and innocence runs, and that while my grandfather died many, many years ago, and at no point, I think, would he have been brought to trial. But if Bruno Dey could find himself in court at the end of his life for what he did during the Nazi period, I think many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Germans who were able to live out the rest of their life unencumbered by criminal trials could have and perhaps should have found themselves on trial as well.
Yeah, and those are some of the huge sort of moral dilemmas that run through your book, and that kept me awake at night whilst I was reading it. Especially this question of blame, as you say, if it's a crime that is that big and so complicated as the Holocaust is. I mean, we're talking about the murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children here. There has to have been some sort of broad consensus in society to make this work, or at the very least, some form of complicity. It's not just the policymakers and the senior commanders given the orders, but also camp guards like Bruno Dey, who basically prevented people from fleeing, made the camp work. You had train drivers. You mention a case in the book about sort of lorry drivers, or the sort of driving commandos, who were briefly, it was considered whether to put them on trial or not, but that wasn't really pursued with any seriousness. The chemists developing the poison gas, the engineers building the crematoria, all of these, policemen who were sort of organizing the deportations, and those are just the people directly involved with it. As you say, you could take this further and further back and end up basically with an entire society on trial. So did you ever get the feeling that Bruno Dey was on trial on behalf of German society, perhaps on behalf of the country itself that enabled Nazism?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and indeed one that was raised by his defense over and over again throughout the trial. Because, of course, the important thing to keep in mind is that someone with Bruno Dey's profile would never have been put on trial in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. It was only in 2011 that German courts started changing their approach to Holocaust crimes. And this was in the case against Ivan Demjanjuk, who had been famously on trial in Israel. It was a case of mistaken identity. He was sentenced to death. That was then quashed. He was released, sent back to the US, and was eventually extradited to Germany. He was a simple concentration camp guard, and he was eventually put on trial in a court in Munich and sentenced and found guilty. For the first time in many decades, German courts accepted that the simple presence at a concentration camp made you at least partially responsible for all the murders that were committed at that camp. That was a radical departure from decades of jurisprudence. And of course, that opened the door to this late flurry of Holocaust trials. But for decades, German courts were not particularly interested in prosecuting these kind of cases. And while Germany, I think, rightly gets a lot of credit for confronting its Nazi past in a very open and impressive manner, one area where, I would argue, the one area where Germany completely failed to deal with the crimes of the past was actually in criminal courts, where sentences, if they were handed down at all, were typically very lenient, and where the whole approach to prosecuting Holocaust trials was premised on the assumption that the real culprits were Hitler, Himmler, Höss, and all the other terrible names that we are familiar with, and that everyone below that was at best an accomplice, but more often than not completely innocent. And so, which was a very convenient and that approach that the that the German legal system took, of course, mirrored conveniently the approach that German society took, which is that, we were as much victims as the others, and we were seduced by the evil genius of Hitler, and responsibility was passed up and up and up and up until really only a handful of culprits ended up taking the blame in the public's mind for the crimes of the Nazis, and most of those were conveniently dead, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another issue apart from this, kind of moral side where you kind of saying, well, the classic "we were only following orders" kind of applies to virtually everybody in the country apart from Hitler and a handful of his cronies. Apart from that, though, there were legal problems as well, weren't there, in terms of the way that you treat the Holocaust as a crime. And as you repeat throughout the book, rightly, the Holocaust was no ordinary crime, not in scale, not in the nature of it. So can you explain a little bit how Germany's justice system struggled with this problem as to how to pin down the Holocaust as such a complex crime and then make individual people sort of responsible for it?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating and complex matter that I only really understood as I worked on this book. German courts treated the Holocaust as normal murder times 6 million. So there was no recognition of the systematic, structural, industrial nature of these murders. And that meant a couple of things. It meant, first of all, that the courts, until this change in 2011, courts typically had to find a concrete link between a perpetrator and a specific murder. So you essentially had to show that perpetrator A killed victims A, B, and C on such and such date in such and such concentration camp. Now, of course, this was an incredibly high standard of proof that, given the industrial and anonymized nature of the Holocaust, was very difficult to meet. The other problem, and this has to do with the way that German law defines murder, is that a very heavy emphasis is placed on subjective motives. So typically in Germany, you will be convicted of murder instead of manslaughter because of an individual's subjective motive, such as lust or envy or things like that. And again, this was incredibly difficult to prove because that was not typical for the Holocaust. The SS man who bundled victims into a gas chamber did not have particular feelings towards their victims. They did what they did because this was their functional role in a highly complex system of murder. And so in some ways, the German legal system, the German judges and prosecutors were struggling to fit the unique nature of the Holocaust into the rigid corset of German criminal law.
It's a problem, right? And normally if you kill someone, you have a direct connection to them. You have a reason to kill them, whilst in this case. And I think that was one of the things that in your book that really got me thinking, because I hadn't seen it from that perspective, that there is almost no connection between the people who are doing the killing and those who are being killed, no personal connection anyway.
And this also meant that when Holocaust trials did occur, such as the famous Frankfurt Auschwitz trial in the early 1960s, typically the courts would punish much more severely the lower ranked brutes. So the SS, the low-ranking SS man who actually could be shown to have murdered, beaten to death, treated with terrible sadism, their individual victims. Whereas the bureaucrats, the senior officers, the ones who were 2 or 3 steps removed from the guns and the bullets and the gas chambers and the lethal injections, they typically got off more lightly than the individual brutes, because as long as you could show one murder committed with your own hands, Germany has a mandatory life sentence for murder. So these low-ranking people would be sentenced to a life in prison. and the far more senior commanding officers who maybe gave the order, but it couldn't be shown precisely on what day and in what context, would be punished less severely. So this was one of the absurdities of the way Germany prosecuted Holocaust crimes in the 60s, 70s, and so forth. But again, I think it fit very neatly with the myth that Germans were telling themselves, which was that there were these Nazi brutes who did terrible things, but it obscured the view of the structural responsibility that was far more important, in my view.
With your legal training in mind, if there had been more of a willingness to confront this, say at the time, or if we had some sort of time machine and could go back and do things differently in the 1950s and 60s, what would there have been an alternative to that? So what struck me in the book was that you talk a little bit about the Nuremberg trials as well. And for them, a new legal basis was almost invented. So the idea that this was a new thing, there wasn't really a kind of precedent for crimes against humanity, for example, war crimes and so on. So, they moved away from this principle in law that you can't punish for somebody for a crime that they committed at the time when there was no law against it. And they deliberately moved away from that in order to be able to prosecute at least the senior Nazis. So would there have been an alternative like that for ordinary camp guards and so on and so forth?
So I think in the 1950s and 60s, in the early decades after the foundation of the Federal Republic, it would have been actually quite difficult, because you would have had to put on trial tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. And I think we have this dilemma every time that a dictatorship comes to an end. How do you move on? How do you secure democracy while at the same time, how do you deliver justice? And I think there's no right or wrong here, but I can see why the thinking in the German leadership, but also among the Allies at the time, was that it is more important to secure democracy, it's more important to defeat communism, it's more important to win Germany for the Western Alliance than putting tens or hundreds of thousands of Germans who were complicit in Nazi crimes on trial. To me, perhaps the more significant failure is the one that came later in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when tens of thousands of these perpetrators were still alive, could have still easily been put on trial, when also far more witnesses and victims were still alive. And this would have come at a time when democracy in Germany had been secured. And the neglect at this point in German post-war history, I find almost more appalling than the one in the 50s and 60s, when Germany was in a much more complex and vulnerable situation.
And given the centrality of the Holocaust in the German national consciousness, I got the feeling, listening to the sort of statements that you recall verbatim, from the judge and from other people in the court, that these trials always have had, but particularly the later ones, a sort of relevance beyond the courtroom, and that everybody in the room is very conscious of that. So under the circumstances, and I think the defense actually raised this point as well, of Bruno Dey, can these trials actually be fair? So you said several times in the book that there was no way that a German court would have acquitted somebody at this point in the position that Bruno Dey found himself in as a teenager. So if anything, they're pushing the boat out further now, legally speaking. So are these late discoveries like Bruno Dey paying for these earlier failings because of the centrality that the Holocaust has to our national consciousness?
So I think we were very fortunate in having a presiding judge in the Bruno Dey case who was not only supremely fair and considerate and empathetic, both with Dey but also with the victims of Stutthof who came to give testimony, but I think who was also very conscious of exactly this danger, that you're basically scapegoating a fairly insignificant old man for the failures of German courts and German judges and prosecutors to bring far more senior perpetrators to trial earlier. That said, at the end of the day, the court simply applied German criminal law. Bruno Dey was a Nazi concentration camp guard. He was a member of the SS, even though he was inducted into the SS rather than having volunteered for it. He played a role in maintaining the concentration camp in which tens of thousands of people were murdered. He was able to bear guilt. He was conscious of the injustice that was being done there. And there was no relevant reason to excuse his actions. So in some ways, the court simply applied existing German criminal law. It applied the tools of the trade for a judge, and came ultimately, I think, to a balanced conclusion. But the court, I think, was very conscious of this risk, and there was, I think, rightly, an attempt not to humiliate or to place more guilt on the shoulders of this old man than he deserved. So I think it was a really important trial, and I think it was also really important to give the survivors and the victims, many of whom were even older than Bruno Dey, a final chance to tell their story in court and to see some small semblance of justice being done at the end of their lives.
And there was still, even in the sort of speeches that were being made and the final verdict, a lesson there, I think, quite explicitly actually. So this idea that an entire generation for which Bruno Dey was basically an example had failed to, quite climb down from the watchtower to say no, when perhaps they should have done, could have done, at least when they were directly confronted with, the genocide directly in front of them at that point. Certainly that's the argument that was made in the court, even if that comes at a personal risk of some description. Even though, and you rightly point this out in the book as well, as that the historians in the courtroom, people weren't necessarily shot or killed for this, but there was some sort of perception in Bruno Dey's mind that something bad would happen to him if he did that. But despite all of this, the argument is they should have climbed down from the watchtower and said no. But you also point out that it's a huge ask, isn't it, of a generation that has been indoctrinated and trained to be obedient, keep their heads down. Particularly Bruno Dey emphasizes this over and over, that in his childhood there were several incidences where he was bullied every time he was sort of noticed by people. So I guess it comes down to the fact that when you have ordinary people like him who are in an extraordinary position, really, you're punishing him, as you say in the book, almost for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Had he grown up somewhere else in a different time, or even in a different country at the same time, he would have probably been a perfectly ordinary person. And I found what you said at the end of the book quite quite disturbing, the idea that, these are ordinary people in effect doing these things. So maybe can you say a bit more about that? Was it a realistic expectation almost to say to somebody, when we are all ordinary people today, and you raise this dilemma in the book, would we have done things differently? And that must have surely played a role in the courtroom as well, that thought.
I mean, I thought one of the most fascinating moments in the trial came in the final verdict, when the judge herself admitted that none of us here can say that we would have acted differently, which is a pretty interesting thing for a judge to say at the end of a criminal trial. But I think it was still absolutely the right thing to say. And I think, if anything, it makes the verdict more significant and more thought-provoking, because what the verdict says is that, the message that I and everyone else, I think, took away from this trial was that all our human frailties and weaknesses and failings and our inability to speak up at the right moment, our fear of being punished, our fear of being ostracized, these are all very human traits, and we all succumb to them from time to time. And it is, of course, harder to resist these pressures when you are faced by the kind of situation that Bruno Dey found himself in. But you have to resist all the same. I mean, that is ultimately what the law demands. And the judge, I think, very powerfully in her final verdict said so, that is the only way you can say I have not made myself guilty. So it is, of course, a huge thing to ask, especially of someone who was only 17 and 18 at the time. But what alternative do we have? We cannot say, it was okay for you to do this. It was okay for you to stand on the watchtower. As difficult as it is in practice, the expectation of a country where the rule of law reigns has to be, you do climb down from your watchtower. You do hand over your gun. You do say no, even at the cost of damage to yourself.
What struck me with that line of argument is, though, that once again the singularity of the Holocaust was kind of at the heart of this. So the idea that Bruno Dey should have said no, several options were explored. One of them was that he should have maybe volunteered to fight on the Eastern Front instead, as some other guards have, and there's evidence that was possible. But what struck me as a historian is that, terrible crimes were committed on the Eastern Front. That was a genocidal war that Hitler was fighting, and an explicitly genocidal war that would have, in the end, had Hitler won, eradicated millions of Slavic people from the region, recolonized the entire region. So he would have effectively made himself, withdrawn from the Holocaust as a crime, as a specific crime, but still made himself an asset to a genocidal regime in some other way. And that wasn't even raised as an issue in the court. And then later on in the book, you also talk about the idea that now the sort of singularity or the unique nature of the Holocaust is coming more and more under fire from different directions, both from the left now, interestingly, as well as from the right. The idea that it's not a specific crime that is somehow different, but should be maybe placed in a wider context of other German crimes, namely colonialism mostly. But I also think, as a historian, in the context of what is done in Eastern Europe, the Poles regularly point this out and say the Holocaust wasn't the only crime that you've committed here. So did you get the feeling that the trial was still very much based on the idea that the Holocaust, there's something unique about that, and that's why Bruno Dey was on trial, but say an old Wehrmacht soldier who contributed in a shooting, say in Poland or whatever, wouldn't have been in the same way? And is there a change in the perception of the Holocaust in Germany now? Do you feel, or is that something that just comes from the fringes?
So I think the question around the singularity of the Holocaust, I mean, it may have hovered a little bit over the trial, but I don't think this was something that really fed into the discussions and decisions that were taken there. What I found fascinating is that this trial coincided, and I think it was probably above all a coincidence, with a new flare-up in the never-ending German discussion around the Holocaust and Holocaust memory culture. And as you just said, the interesting development is that Germany's established memory culture and the idea that the Holocaust was a singular crime from which Germany should derive a singular set of responsibilities and lessons is under attack, not just from the far right. We're obviously used to that. We know that neo-Nazis and the far right want to downplay the crimes of Germany, but it's also come under attack from the sort of progressive camp. And they, one of the arguments made and is, as you just said, that Germany also has responsibility for some terrible crimes, including genocide in their colonial rule. But the other challenge, I think, to Germany's established memory culture and this idea that the Holocaust is a defining and integral part of German identity is, where does that leave the quarter of the population that has a migrant background? So do we expect someone who, or like do we expect a German whose family migrated to Germany maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago from Turkey, from Italy, from Russia, from wherever? Is the Holocaust also integral to their conception of what it means to be German? And is there not an almost exclusionary aspect to this, that only if you can trace your ancestry back to the perpetrators and you then have the corresponding sense of responsibility, can you be a proper German? I mean, this is all quite complex and in some ways arcane stuff, but it is, as you will know, something that is debated with real intensity in Germany, and not least around difficult geopolitical times like we have now, where Germany is once again discussing its relationship towards Israel and the Middle East. So I think this was again for me one of the aspects that made writing about this trial worthwhile is that it coincided with related and fascinating questions about how Germany relates to its past and what lessons it should learn from it.
Yeah, those are all huge questions, aren't they, around morality, history, memory, culture, about what we do today, what we get right, what we get wrong. So has this book changed you in any way, writing it, thinking about it?
God, that's a tough question.
Sorry, I left it to the
end. I think it has certainly made me re-engage with a theme that was very important to me as a teenager. I think it was very important to many of us as teenagers. It's this question that never really lets you go. How could this happen? And I rediscovered how important the question is to Germany, but also to myself. So yes, it was, as you know, it's a lot of work writing books, but I was very glad I did it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I certainly there were several moments in the book where I thought, oh, I hadn't seen it that way, or I hadn't thought about it in that way, and they're all huge questions to grapple with. So sadly, really, we haven't got any more time to grapple with those questions today. But what a fascinating topic, and so relevant for today as well. So I hope, dear listeners, you will now feel inclined to pick up a copy of Tobias Buck's Final Verdict, Holocaust Trial in the 21st Century. It really is a gripping read, one of those books that will keep you thinking a long time after you've turned the last page. Thank you so much, Tobias, for regaling us with all your insights.
Thank you so much.
Tschüss und auf Wiedersehen from Central London.